Well, thank you, Anthony, and thanks to all of you for coming tonight, particularly on this beautiful spring evening. No one understands the high opportunity costs you're incurring better than an economist, given the weather outside. I'd like to start by asking you to imagine the typical minimum wage worker. So I'm thinking of someone behind a counter or working at a checkout line in a discount retail store, maybe a fast food restaurant. Late 20s, maybe early 30s, might be a single parent. Just barely got through high school, unlikely to have much higher education. They work long hours, work nights, work weekends, struggle to handle childcare and juggle all of that. I can go on and on, but let's keep this image in our back of our minds as we discuss this topic this evening. Let me pause and start by saying that I understand there are lots of ways to look at any policy issue, sociologically, historically, politically, but I'm going to do economics. I'm going to use the lens of economics to look at this issue. And this means a focus on costs and benefits, and if economists have a bias, it's on efficiency. It's not that we don't want to help people, but we want to design policies that use our scarce resources in the most efficient way, the most efficient manner. In the case of the minimum wage, the benefits are visible and obvious, but the costs are often much more subtle and hidden. In the end, we don't have to agree on everything tonight, but I hope you might think about this issue a little bit differently than you did before you came. That's sort of my goal. So, I totally recognize that this graph only reinforces stereotypes about economists, and it's probably the worst way I could have started, but I think it's instructive, and I also think it's got a lot of insights. In fact, these ideas I'm going to talk about here in a second when I explain this graph are very familiar to you if you've studied economics, but I would submit that one reason why it can be very hard to have any kind of a conversation about economic policy and not have it become hyper-partisan and mean-spirited is that those of us in the econ profession have done a very poor job of making our ideas accessible to the average person, right? So let me try and explain this model to you, and then we're going to use this a couple of times throughout the presentation. So what we're looking at here is this axis is just wages, and they get bigger as we go up. So this is a labor market. Maybe think about the fast food labor market. Okay, so a minimum wage labor market. Wages get bigger as we go up, and then the number of workers get bigger as we go this direction. Supply. S stands for supply. In this labor market, the suppliers of labor are, of course, workers. And this thing is upward sloping because more workers want to work at high wages than at low wages. I often do a little experiment in my class where I hand out a sheet and I ask students, how many hours do you want to work at? $2, $3, up to 20, 30, 40, 50. Well, they'll quit school at $50 an hour, right? They'll work as many hours as you'll let them. So it's just incentives, right? It's employee incentives. The downward sloping line is a demand curve. The demanders of labor are firms, right? And so they demand more workers at low wages, generally, and less at high wages. It's just incentives. It's just the way a firm would behave, given the incentives they're given. And then we call this the equilibrium, but you can just think about how employees and employers, they work together and eventually settle on a wage, right? That gets determined through supply and demand or through a bargaining process. The outcomes aren't always fair. Aaron Rodgers makes a lot more than the teachers in the Sheboygan area school districts, or actually the professors at Lakeland College, but wages aren't determined by fairness or justice. They're determined by scarcity and productivity and skills, right? So Rodgers' skills are scarce and they're in high demand. That's why he makes a lot of money. I think almost everyone can see the supply and demand sets the price of gas or the price of an apartment, but I think people struggle when it's labor. It just seems different. And let me just use this as an example. This graph is a perfect illustration of supply and demand at work. This was taken in North Dakota. And many of you may know they have a booming energy economy, so huge demand, but tight supply, and look what happens to labor. Look what happens to the wages for low-skilled labor. Extremely high, right? The minimum wage is irrelevant in North Dakota. The current situation in the United States, as many of you probably know, as of July of 2009, the federal minimum wage is $7.25 per hour, and many states like Wisconsin follow that law. 17 states have minimum wages that are higher than the federal wage. The highest is in Washington state at $9.47 per hour. Some municipalities have their own minimum wages. It's $11.05 in San Francisco, and Seattle just passed a $15 per hour minimum wage, but only for franchises. So if you franchises must subscribe to that. The blue states that are on my map here, they adjust their minimum wage based on the cost of living every year, so it adjusts yearly. And Connecticut just passed a $10.10 per hour minimum wage by 2017. And this was what President Obama submitted to Congress. He suggested that we should raise the federal minimum wage to $10.10 per hour. And that's a very popular proposal. So why a minimum wage? Well, there's many arguments in favor of it. First, you want to help those that need the help. If someone works full-time, they shouldn't have to live in poverty. And that's where the $10.10 per hour number actually came from. That's how President Obama generated it. So if you work full-time at $10.10 per hour, you live above the American poverty line. Some suggest it would increase what's called the labor force participation rate. So this is the number of people, of our adults, that are actually in the labor force. And that inducing more in the labor force would be very helpful to the United States, particularly given our demographic issues with baby boomers retiring, Social Security and Medicare problems. So some argue it for that way. Obviously, it provides more income, so low-income people can spend more, right? That would help the rest of the economy. Others suggest it makes workers more productive. So they miss less work, they work harder. That was kind of Henry Ford's $5 per day, right? That was his idea, was he'd get more productivity, people would miss less work and work harder. That's called the efficiency wage theory. And Walmart may subscribe to it because they just announced they've raised their minimum wage to $9 per hour voluntarily. So every job will be at least $9 per hour if you work at Walmart. I would submit that it's easy for the media to find those that are helped by the minimum wage because you just interview those who get a raise. And I think that adds to its popularity. Economists, however, look at the minimum wage as what we call a price floor. So I'm going to use that same graph again, but this time I've drawn a minimum wage on it. So this is important because it really makes the crux of my argument here. So let me walk you through what's changed. Again, we have this, remember my example before, this equilibrium was the wage that was determined through supply and demand, but the government may say that that wage is too low in some industry, like fast food. And a minimum wage then says, well, we call it a price floor because wages can't fall below the floor, right? That's what the floor means. So wages can't go below this. Now the point that economists would make here, though, is at this high wage, or higher than here, what happens to the supply of labor? Well, lots of people want to work at higher wages. But what do firms think about higher wages? They tend to demand less labor. So the difference between these two is unemployment. So minimum wages generally cause some unemployment in an economy. And that's what we're going to look at a little more carefully as we move forward here. I know we're talking about people here, but it's just simply a fact that you can't make a Ford Focus as valuable as a Ford Explorer just because the government says so. And that's really what the minimum wage is doing for unskilled workers. Just because the government says they're worth more doesn't make them more productive doesn't make them more productive or skilled. Right? And that's kind of the idea here. Try a thought experiment. Let's make the minimum wage $100 per hour. Wouldn't that solve all of our poverty problems? It would be great for workers, wouldn't it? $100 per hour. Everybody could make $100 per hour. Of course, if you think about my graph now, that unemployment effect now has gotten very big and very real. Right? Employers are going to hire very few workers at $100 per hour, but lots of people are going to want to work at that wage. So that's kind of the issue. How much unemployment occurs depends on, first, how high we set the wage above the equilibrium, and how sensitive employers are to wage increases. That certainly depends on location. I would submit San Francisco can have a higher minimum wage than Minocqua. Higher costs, right? Cost of living. The strength of local economy matters. North Dakota is my example, right? They can have a higher minimum wage and have little effect. And the sector matters. I mean, it's easier to replace labor with technology in some industries than others. I was just in LaGuardia Airport in New York City. I went to an entire food court. You could have had Chinese, tacos, burgers, no human beings. You ordered on an iPad, and it was slid down to me on a conveyor, and I paid with my Apple Pay. No people involved, right? An entire food court's operating. So, and New York has a high minimum wage. So they were able to substitute labor with technology. The most prestigious group of economists in the United States, called the National Bureau of Economic Research. This is the group that dates U.S. recessions when we have them. They reviewed literally hundreds of studies from around the country, different states, and different countries around the world. And I'll just quote from their conclusion about minimum wages. Quote, "The evidence shows that minimum wages pose a trade-off of higher wages for some against job losses for others." And that's the idea I'm trying to convey here. And these labor market effects, I think, are harder to see because it may be a job never created or a job eliminated slowly, which makes it a harder thing for the media to cover. The nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office looked into President Obama's proposal of $10.10 per hour, and their conclusion was, yeah, it would help many people. 900,000 would be lifted from poverty, but at the expense of unemploying 500,000 low-wage workers. So there's a trade-off. And don't forget, the minimum wage and the maximum wage is zero when you're unemployed, right? So you're truly hurting people if you're taking away their jobs while helping others. What about in Sheboygan? Well, census data reveals a fair amount. Today, under 2% of all workers here make the current minimum wage. If we raise the minimum wage to $10.10 per hour, that would affect approximately 10,000 Sheboygan area workers, or about 18% of our labor force. When I applied the CBO's same methodology to Sheboygan, the job losses from this policy would be somewhere between 2.5% and 11% of those workers, or up to 1,200 workers. I can't know for sure because now we're at very granular census data. All we can know we don't know for sure which sectors people work in. We don't know all the details, but if I apply the same methodology the economists use at the CBO, we're looking at job losses of perhaps as many as 1,200 workers. We do know in Sheboygan that the majority of low-wage workers, minimum wage workers, work either in food preparation and service, office and administrative support, or personal care and service. Okay, so who makes the minimum wage? Well, 2.9% of all U.S. workers, 2.4% of Wisconsin workers, and like I said before, about 2% of Sheboygan workers. So we're talking about a very small number of workers. The average family income of a minimum wage worker is about $53,000 a year, so above the nation's median. According to the current population survey, there are really kind of two groups that make the minimum wage. Group one, which is about half, 50.5%, are young people. They're under 25. So about half minimum wage workers are under 25. Of this group, about 80% work part-time. Most are in college or high school. Only 5% are married, and they come from families with an income of over $66,000 per year. That's about half the workers. The other half are adults, so the other 49.5%. They're 25 or older. They have average incomes of around $42,500. About half of them work part-time, 41% are married, and 22% didn't finish high school. Okay, so I see these as two very different groups, is the point I'm trying to make. Interestingly, only 4% of minimum wage workers are single parents working full-time, compared with over 5.6% of all American workers. So it's actually less likely that a minimum wage worker would be a single parent working full-time than the general population. So my summary of that would be more than half of minimum wage workers are young, working part-time while they're in school, and are often dependent of their family. I don't think these are people we generally target with social programs. In fact, I love my son Patrick. He's 15. But I wouldn't pay him $10.10 per hour. I honestly wouldn't. He just doesn't have the skills to justify that wage. He's a typical 15-year-old boy. He's lazy, he's shy, he likes to sleep, he's irresponsible. I want him to work to learn the skills he needs, like hard work, like showing up on time, like being responsible. And study after study shows that as we raise the minimum wage, we eliminate the kind of jobs that Patrick or other teenagers need to get a start. So those are the kind of reasons why I think the policy has some adverse effects. Is it a good anti-poverty program? Well, again, U.S. Census Bureau data is very instructive. So who in Wisconsin or nationally is in poverty? Generally those that don't work, or don't finish high school, or are single parents. In fact, if you do all three of those, you almost certainly will live in poverty. Only 17% of families in poverty have an adult working full-time. About 40% have an adult working at all. So let me try that again. Only 17% of families in poverty have an adult working full-time, and only about 40% have an adult working at all. The minimum wage isn't a very efficient way to help the poor, since the poor often aren't working. I think most would agree there's an inherent value in subsidizing the wages of a single mother in the labor market living on the minimum wage. I'm with you on that. I think less see value, though, in subsidizing an affluent teen's wages. And my problem with the minimum wage is this blunt policy doesn't distinguish between the two groups. It rewards everyone. So increasing the minimum wage causes some unemployment among the low-skilled and rewards all kinds of people we don't need to reward. That is what I would term inefficient. How do you improve the policy? If we're going to have a minimum wage, and many countries don't, but if we're going to have a minimum wage, I think we should set it locally. I mean, should it be the same in Manhattan and Glen Beulah? It doesn't make any sense. The USA is way too big to have a federal minimum wage. It doesn't make any sense. I would consider a two-tiered minimum wage. Could we have a different minimum wage, a lower one for teenagers, or maybe for dependents on their family? Maybe a training minimum wage that expires in 6 months. That's what they have in Canada. So teens for 6 months can be paid a lower minimum wage. We have to be very careful when you design policies like this because you don't want to create incentives not to hire adults and then only hire teens, right? So these kind of social programs can be complicated. And this is just rhetorical, but I'll ask, are politicians good at determining the appropriate minimum wage? That's really what we're doing here, right? That's who we're leaving this to. Another idea. I think the minimum wage helps all kinds of workers that don't need the help. Economists want to help those that do need the help in an efficient way. So I would suggest we raise the earned income tax credit. I think that would be a more effective way to help those we're trying to help. This is a government subsidy only available to the working poor. You can think about it as a reverse income tax or a negative income tax. So workers get back all of the taxes they pay throughout the year and more to potentially offset Social Security taxes or Medicare taxes or that kind of thing. It expands employment because it gives an incentive to work because you take home more, and it encourages employers to hire more because part of the cost of employment is being covered by the subsidy. And studies after study have found this to be a very effective way to help low-wage workers and induce more into the labor force, more to work. I'm going to read as slowly as I can here from a CBO study about the EITC. Okay, so here's what the Congressional Budget Office says about the earned income tax credit. To achieve any increase in the resources of lower income families requires a greater shift of resources if done by raising the minimum wage than if done by increasing the earned income tax credit. The reason is that a minimum wage increase would add to the resources of most families of low-wage workers regardless of their incomes. For example, 1/3 of minimum wage workers would be in families whose incomes was more than 3 times the federal poverty threshold. By contrast, an increase in the EITC would go almost entirely to low-income families. That to me is more efficient. In other words, the EITC is focused only on the needy, so it makes the best use of this money. So in conclusion, I think we know that raising the minimum wage can be a contentious issue. We may see that in a few minutes here. While it would clearly help some, it would come at the cost of hurting others. Jobs lost, jobs never created, and of course, employer costs. While the beneficiaries are visible and obvious, the costs can be subtle and hidden. The minimum wage causes unemployment among low-skilled workers, estimated to be as many as 1,200 workers in Sheboygan County if we raised it to $10.10 per hour, as the president suggests. Very few people make the minimum wage, and of this already very small group, another small share of them are actually adults working full-time and living on this wage. The hypothetical worker I started with does need help, but I would submit the minimum wage isn't the way to do it. The earned income tax credit is a much more efficient and effective way to assist those in need that need a little help. So thank you for your attention.